Hey guys, how you going? Hope you're all doing very well. This evening I'm going to be doing another movie review, so hopefully you find this one interesting. This movie is a war film from Australia, English language, released in the year 2019, directed by Crib Stenders, and this film is called Danger Close Battle of Long Tan. So Danger Close Battle of Long Tan takes place in the Vietnam War, Australia's involvement in 1966. A group of 108 soldiers from Australia and New Zealand, they were very inexperienced and they were tasked with going to the plantation of Long Tan. So they get there and they realise they're under attack by 2,500 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong soldiers who will stop at nothing in order to overrun this regiment, and so the regiment has to fight off the oncoming advances of the Vietnamese, or North Vietnamese and Viet Cong, in time for the reinforcements to help them. So whether or not they can last that long is something you're going to have to find out for yourself, because that's as far as I'm going with my synopsis. Now my thoughts on Danger Close Battle of Long Tan. This is a movie that does have a little bit of hype, and it was one of the rare occasions where an Australian film was shown in cinemas. And a lot of people like this movie, and so for that reason I definitely had to go and check it out. Now when it comes to war films, Australia don't make too many, and when they make war films it's usually about the World War. So you've got Gallipoli, Light Horseman, fantastic war films, but when it comes to the Vietnam War, it's definitely a war that is very controversial. There's a lot of animosity behind Australia's involvement in this, and as is the case with the USA, a lot of these soldiers were abused when they came back home, which I thought was incredibly unfair. So that was definitely a very interesting aspect of the Vietnam War. But pushing politics aside, this is not about whether or not we should have been involved in the war. This is about courage and bravery in the face of adversity. And so I thought, all right, well, this is a movie. Is it a movie that's going to really pull on the heartstrings and overdo the patriotism, which a lot of war films do, especially from South Korea and Russia? They are very patriotic, but they go a little bit too far in really pushing that agenda. So coming into this movie, I was very interested to see a film documenting Australia's involvement in a war that hasn't really been documented too much before. And so Crib Stenders was another reason why I really wanted to see this film. Now, if you are familiar with Australian cinema, you may have heard of Crib Stenders. I've reviewed a few of his films. I'm a massive fan of this guy, but he is definitely a localised director. Is that not many people outside Australia have heard of this guy, which is a great shame because he is very underrated. He just hasn't got to the level of Baz Luhrmann and Peter Weir, who have made films on a worldwide market, whereas Crib Stenders has made very good movies, but they have been very localised, which is the case with a lot of Australian directors out there. So combining the director with a war film in a very interesting part of time, I thought was a recipe for absolute success. And so after watching the movie, I will say that there are moments that were brilliant, but unfortunately there were moments that weren't quite so good, that were a little bit too obvious to ignore. And so I couldn't really judge this movie as a masterpiece. I wanted to love it because there are really good moments, but as far as a consistent piece, I just thought it was a little bit disjointed, which is something I'll go into a little bit later. But the positives to this movie is that it is a movie that is showing you courage and bravery, but it's not going over the top as far as patriotism is concerned. It's not necessarily saying, look how brave Australians are. What it's really saying is that never give up, always show courage, but it's the horrors of war. And I really like the idea that Crib Stenders used war as a horror tool, as opposed to something like a shoot-'em-up game, like a modern Call of Duty, Modern Warfare, or something like that. Is a lot of these war films out there, they make them very entertaining. It's popcorn sort of cinema, which is something that I can excuse if it's a war that is not based on reality. But when you've got a movie that is retelling a real life event, I think there is a duty of the director to show a level of respect and not glorifying the violence, not glorifying the fact that you want to be in that first person shooter. This is an environment that you don't want to be a part of. This is showing you the horrors of war. Just the way the fight scenes are choreographed, you've got a lot of bullets flying everywhere. You can actually see the gunfire, and that actually made it terrifying, is because the soldiers could have died at any second. And putting yourself in that situation, that's a situation you don't want to be in. So if you feel as though you don't want to be in a war, it's doing its job. It's because war is very destructive and wasteful. And so I thought that was just a really horrifying aspect that I think Crib Stenders used in a very respectful manner. So you've also got mortars that are exploding everywhere, and the fight and the gun battles are absolutely frenetic. They are very intense and raw, and at the end of each battle you have to get your breath back, and so you actually feel like you're beside these soldiers shooting at this oncoming enemy. And so I think that the choreography of the battle sequences I thought was raw and realistic without going over the top with, excessive gore. There's hardly any gore in the film, which I think is definitely, as I said, it's not overdoing the violence, it's not glorifying the violence. And I think, as I said, you can glorify violence in a made-up war, but when you're retelling a story, I just think it's a little bit better to actually play down the violence to a degree. You can show the horrors of war and still have terrible violence, but when you show excessive gore and all that kind of stuff, then it does come to a point where you think, is that, okay, the director's having a little bit too much fun with this. And so I'm not necessarily saying gore is bad in a war film, because Saving Private Ryan was an absolute masterpiece, and that was very gory and shocking, but that was done in a way where you weren't feeling as though you were in a first-person shooter, and so hopefully you guys know what I mean by that. You've also got, as I said, it's the bravery, the courage, never give up. No matter how much the odds are stacked against you, you can still pull through if you really try, and you pull together and you work together as a team. And so I think that message is very important to really portray, and I just think, again, that's another respectful way that Crib Stenders was honouring what these soldiers were going through and the horrors they had to face. I thought the cinematography was excellent. I could feel the sweat, blood and tears. I could feel the anxiety, and the whole film was just an exercise in anxiety, and the anxious quality that the viewer will have, I just think, was really putting you into the shoes of these very, very brave soldiers. And you've also got the song 19, which is a classic Australian song that is basically an indication of what these characters, what these soldiers actually had to go through. And so if you've heard the song 19, it's a classic of Australia. It definitely was an added bonus in what was a movie that was impressive, but unfortunately had qualities about it that prevented it from being a brilliant movie. Now, the qualities that prevented it from being a brilliant film was the characterisation of each individual soldier. I felt as though, okay, I could feel for the regiment, I could feel the fact that they were hopelessly outnumbered and that the odds were against them and it looked very grim, and the bravery, it basically makes you proud to be an Australian without going over the top with the patriotism. But unfortunately, I didn't gravitate to the characters individually, and so I think that the director was more concerned with making the battles as realistic as possible and as horrifying as possible, and giving you a respectful sort of honour of these soldiers. But as far as the characterisation of individuals, I just don't think enough attention was put into them. And if you actually cared for these soldiers as much, if you actually felt as though they were family or friends, then I thought the battle scenes would have been even more terrifying. And so the characterisation's just not there, and I just don't think it really paid tribute to what this director really wanted, with actually showing you a film about Australia's plight, Australia and New Zealand, the Anzacs, their plight and what they had to go through. I just think you feel for them as a whole, as a generalisation, as a regiment, but as individuals, I just didn't really care for any of these soldiers. I didn't feel as though they were my brother or my friend, and I just really couldn't get into it. And so there are moments where they tell you about their story, but I just thought that was a little bit force-fed, and it didn't really match the quality of the positives that this movie possesses. And there were some moments, there's one moment in particular that had my eyes rolling. I'm not going to tell you what happens, but it was very Hollywood, and I thought that theatrical moment just felt disjointed. It felt completely out of the film. Is that this movie had a strong level of realism, it had a strong level of respect, but there was one moment that was typical of Hollywood where you just think as though it was theatrical, it was there to kind of use the audience on a string. Basically, I have to be very careful not to give anything away, but I just thought as though that wasn't needed, and that was there solely for being a movie. And so that's another criticism I have of the film. But the biggest criticism, as I said, was the fact that I felt that these soldiers, these were actors playing soldiers as opposed to soldiers really being there in 1966, and that ultimately is the issue with this film. But pushing that aside, it is exceptionally well made. The battle scenes are very, very exhausting, which is not something you get often with war films, and so to be able to put yourself there as an individual and live the moment, I thought was really impressive, and therefore it's the reason why I would recommend this movie. So Danger Close, Battle of Long Tan, it's coming recommended. It's not perfect, but it's certainly impressive. So overall, I'm going to give this film 3.5 stars. Go out there and see it. Alright guys, that's it for my review. Hope you enjoyed it. Till next time, keep watching movies, and I'll see you later. Bye.